In 1838, a British officer from the East India Company named Lieutenant Robert Leach was visiting Afghanistan on a mission, and he stumbled upon an unusual group of people. They were nomads primarily inhabiting western Afghanistan with a societal structure based on clans, but most interestingly, they spoke a distinct archaic Mongolian dialect. Lieutenant Leach, known for his interest in documenting the peoples of India and studying the local languages, was quite surprised by this encounter. Who were these people? To understand the story of this mysterious group, let's go back 600 years to the 13th century, when the world was witnessing the golden age of the Mongols. From 1206, when Genghis Khan rose to power as the leader of the Mongols, to Kublai Khan's death in 1294, the Mongols conquered vast territories at an unimaginable speed. Like many powers in Asia, the Khwarezm Empire, comprising present-day Iran and Afghanistan, could not resist the Mongol forces. In 1221, this region came fully under Mongol control. Presumably around this time, a large Mongol garrison was stationed near the city of Herat by the order of Genghis Khan. Years passed, and the soldiers of this garrison permanently settled in these lands with their families. They never returned to Mongolia, nor maintained further contact with their kinsmen. Over the centuries, they formed a separate diaspora, continued speaking Mongolian, and retained their distinct culture and way of life in western Afghanistan. Today, the descendants of these medieval Mongol soldiers are known as the Moghol people, and the variety of Mongolian they speak is called the Moghol language. This language still carries significant influence from medieval Mongolian, which was spoken during Genghis Khan's era. Since the 13th century, the Mongols have been cut off from the Mongolian linguistic community and surrounded primarily by Turkic and Iranic peoples. They lived in relative isolation and developed independently. In the early 20th century, some Western scholars noted that the Mongols who lived in remote valleys and mountain villages had far fewer Persian and Turkic loanwords in their language and had managed to better preserve the Mongolic way of life, including their clan structure. However, Mongols living in lower lands were much more influenced by Persian and Turkic cultures. To understand the Mongol people, we must acknowledge that they and their language are not well studied. There are simply not many sources about them, and most of the detailed fieldwork to study them were conducted between 1830s and 1970s. As a result, there are very few photos of the Mongol people available online. I've been researching this group for 2 months and have only managed to find a handful of images. Now let's go through a timeline to see how outsiders came to learn about the Mongols. As I mentioned earlier, in 1838, British officer Robert Leach encountered the Mongols and briefly documented their language by recording 14 verbs, 29 phrases, numbers from 1 to 7, and a vocabulary list containing 129 words. However, Leach did not provide an estimate of the Mongol population or the number of Mongol speakers. In 1903, Finnish linguist Gustav John Ramstad traveled to the Russian-Afghan border and managed to find 2 Mongols who spoke the language. However, he had to cut his trip short when all 3 of them fell ill with malaria shortly after their meeting. Despite this, Ramstad still managed to gather significant information. He noticed strong Persian influence on Mongols' phonology, morphology, and syntax. He also recorded that Mongol was historically written using the Perso-Arabic script, and that existing Mongol literature primarily consisted of Islamic texts, poetry, and Mongol-Persian vocabularies. He did not provide an estimate of the Mongol population, though at that time common estimates suggested fewer than 10,000 Mongols in Afghanistan, with only a few thousand presumed to speak the language to different degrees. However, later studies would prove this estimate to be overly optimistic. Between 1936 and 1937, Hungarian linguist Lajos Ligeti visited Afghanistan to find Mongol speakers and document their language and culture. By then, Mongol was presumed to have gone extinct, yet he managed to find some speakers. However, for some reason, Ligeti never published his findings or field notes from this trip. To this day, they remain in the archives of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. In 1954 and 1955, Japanese historian Shinobu Iwamura and American sociologist Herbert Franz Sherman traveled across Afghanistan on horseback to document Mongol villages. They discovered additional Mongol settlements, tape-recorded spoken Mongol, and most importantly found the Zirni manuscript. This manuscript, discovered in the house of a local Pashto landlord in the city of Herat, contained the Persian Moghol glossary written in the Perso-Arabic script. It is often considered one of the most significant findings regarding the Moghol language. Another compelling discovery from this field study was Shinobu Iwamura's realization that the Mongols were much more widespread in Afghanistan than Robert Leach's notes from 1838 suggested. Leach had mentioned that the Mongols lived around the Bagran region of Kandahar and the Marigan region of Herat. However, Iwamura's map of Mughal villages in Afghanistan was much more extensive, documenting additional Mughal settlements further north. Despite this, as opposed to earlier accounts, this expedition left us with a grimmer estimate for the Mughal population in Afghanistan, just a few thousand, with the number of Mughal speakers presumed to be in the hundreds. By the 1950s, it was noted that across the small Mughal communities in Afghanistan, hardly anything survived from the traditional Mongolian way of life. Shamanism and nature worship had been overtaken by Islam, Mongol clan names and structures had vanished, and most people were speaking Dari as their first language. However, despite being followers of Islam, the Mughals still commonly used the word Tengri, meaning god or deity, in the ancient Turkic and Mongolic nature-based belief system. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, German scholar Michael Weers conducted extensive fieldwork among the Mughal people in Afghanistan's Herat province. He noted that since the 1950s, the Mughal presence in the country had mostly been confined to small villages in Herat. Weers estimated that around 3,000 ethnic Mongols were left in the country, with only about 200 of them speaking Mughal. However, he emphasized that out of these 200, only a few could speak Mughal as a native language. Now let's dive deeper into the characteristics of the Mughal language and compare it with Middle Mongolian and Modern Mongolian. Before we continue, I want to remind you once more that the sources on the Mughal people and their language are quite limited and inconsistent. However, I've still tried to provide as much information as possible. Middle and Modern Mongolian have vowel harmony, whereas in Mughal it has been lost due to Persian influence. Middle and Modern Mongolian have 8 grammatical cases, whereas Mughal has a simpler case system with significant Persian influence. Middle and Modern Mongolian strictly follow an SOV word order, whereas Mughal also follows a SVO order due to Persian influence. Loanwords in Middle Mongolian are mostly of Turkic origin. In Modern Mongolian, we see many Turkic, Chinese, and Russian loanwords. However, the Mughal vocabulary contains a high number of Persian loanwords. The cardinal numbers show some similarities and differences across these 3 languages. Here are the numbers from 1 to 20. Although most of these numbers are similar to one another, you can see that the pronunciation of the Middle Mongolian and Mughal numbers is slightly more alike, especially when it comes to numbers 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 10. And now let's take a look at the proposed Mughal alphabet. The Mongolian alphabet has 35 letters, whereas Mughal has 29. Since Mughal uses the Perso-Arabic script and Modern Mongolian uses the Cyrillic script, I am displaying the Latin equivalents of these letters for better clarity. Unlike Modern Mongolian, Mughal does not have the vowel Ö. It is possible that at some point Mughal did have this vowel, but over time it was lost due to Persian influence. Additionally, Modern Mongolian includes several additional letters borrowed from the Russian language. Now let's review some examples to see how a sentence sounds in Mughal and Modern Mongolian. I will do my best, but I will probably still butcher the pronunciation of these sentences. What is your name in Mongolian would be Tani Nar Kanbe, however in Mughal it would be Namche Yamabe. Where are you going in Mongolian is Kasha Yav Baiga Yumbe, however in Mughal it is Kanur Chenautar. How old are you is Takeden Nastaive in Mongolian and Umurtani Kedosalbe in Mughal. Is your father alive is Avchini Amid U in Mongolian, and in Mughal it is Babatane Amdunabe. Here we see a real-life example of the differences in vocabulary between Mughal and Mongolian. The word for father in Mongolian is Av, which appears in the Mongolian sentence. However, in Mughal, the word Baba is used for father, which is borrowed from Persian. I'm fascinated by the Mughal people and their language. Imagine being cut off from your ancestral homeland and living an isolated life in a foreign country for centuries without fully losing your language. The world is truly a fascinating place, and it is such a great pleasure for me to explore these cultural remnants with you. Well, my friends, let's fast forward to today. In the last few decades, Afghanistan has gone through significant turmoil. Soviet-Afghan War, Afghan Civil War, Taliban rule, US invasion, and Taliban rule again. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives, and many were displaced or deported. Therefore, today, it is very difficult to determine the current state of the Mughal people and their language. In addition, since the 1970s, there hasn't been any substantial fieldwork conducted to document the Mughals, so most of what we know about them is based on information that is over 50 years old. Today, there are 2 main perspectives regarding the current state of the Mughal people and their language. The first suggests that fewer than 2,000 ethnic Mongols remain in Afghanistan and that the Mughal language became extinct in the 1990s. The second claims that around 3,000 ethnic Mongols still exist, with only a few dozen speakers of the language. Since the Mongols primarily live in isolated areas, including remote mountain villages, and speak Dari as their first language, it is difficult to accurately estimate their present situation. Of course, my wishful thinking makes me want to believe that this archaic language is still spoken somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan. This whole unknown factor adds a certain appealing mystery. Well, my friends, I hope you enjoyed this video because I certainly enjoyed making it. Thanks for watching and see you soon.